Okay, here's a video once again illuminating some biblical truths and connecting them to Taoism, and in doing so illuminating the inner meaning. So in the Gospel of John, at the beginning, it says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." That's how it starts. So you have a Word, then the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So you have something, and then you add to it, and then you essentially the first thing becomes recontextualized. So you have the Word is with God, and the Word is God. So there's like a collapsing or a converging in the third phase, but you have three stages. In the beginning of the book of Genesis, God says, and I'm going to use extemporaneously derived and slightly inebriated version of Young's literal translation for this. You have God, Genesis chapter 1, verse 3. God says, "Let light be," and light is. And then God sees that the light is good and separates the light from the darkness. And then you have evening. There was evening, and there was morning, and there was the first day. So there's a word in the sense of an expression. A word is a verbal or written. Using a word is you use language to express something, and then you have God seeing that the light is good and separating light from the darkness. So again, you start with God said, "Let light be," and so there's one thing, and then God sees that the light is good and creates two things, separates light from the darkness. But then at the end, God says, then at the end there is evening, and there is morning, and there's the first day. So it's the exact same pattern. There is one thing, light, and then there's light separated from darkness, but then the day brings the light and darkness together, which is how a day works. You have sunrise and sunset. So what I did here, language, when you say "in the beginning was the Word," well, word itself, in quotes, if you want to think about it that way, is just a word. It is four English letters that point to a concept. So you can really use anything as an abstraction to point to a concept. So I just used circles here. So you have a word. This is from the beginning of the Gospel of John, and here's from the beginning of Genesis. God says, "Let light be." So you have a word. Then over here, you have two things. In the Gospel of John is the Word was with God. So you have a word, and then I just used a darkened circle. The Word was with God. So you have two things. And it doesn't matter too much necessarily what abstractions you use, but I decided to use a circle that with no coloring in it to represent Word, and a circle with darkness in it to separate God. So God sees that the Word is good and separates light from the darkness, so you end up with two. The Word is with God. Then in the third one, the Word was God, is what John says. So what happens, what I did here, the Word was God, what ends up happening is you converge the two things together. You collapse them together, because in the book of Genesis, it concludes that the beginning of creation concludes with there was evening and there was morning, the first day. So a day brings morning and evening together. It takes these two things and converges them and recontextualizes it and relabels. The Word was with God. You synthesize. So you have say, see, and separate, and synthesize. Now, the say is something that we use often to describe verbal expression, something that you would hear, although you can use it to describe something that you might write. See is generally used to describe something that you see. Of course, you can see letters, but like say and see can be at odds if you're in a sense, in that if this is a sound and this you're talking about using your eyes to see, that might be different. But what's interesting is that language brings the two things together when it's written. So when you see word, you're seeing something that someone says, if that makes sense. But basically the idea is that they are exactly similar in the beginning of the Gospel of John is an echo and a retelling of the creation myth in the book of Genesis. And John is a different type of gospel from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the synoptic gospels. They tend to agree on details. They have a lot of things that occur and are described quite similarly, although often not identically, in those three gospels. John tends to tell a lot of the same stories and what seem like some different ones, but in a different way. So it's like a different perspective on it. But the idea is you have this one thing which is like two things and then gets collapsed into one thing. So if you think about the way hearing works or vision works, either or, there's something outside of you that enters your body, and it enters it through two holes. You have a left ear and a right ear. You have a left eye and a right eye. And then that gets collapsed into one image or one sound by your mind. So you end up with external output processed by two portals in your body that your mind then converges and collapses into one thing. And that requires, in Taoism, darkness represents kind of receptivity and acceptance and passive, more passive, and white represents active and creative. And so it is a combination, a synthesis of creation and receptivity, vision and hearing and smell. You end up with, it's describing how the senses work. So you end up with something outside, somebody says something verbally, or you see somebody express something through body language. They can say something through body language. And either your eyes or your ears, or perhaps in combination, but light goes through two holes in your skull for vision and two holes in your skull for hearing, but your mind collapses it into one. And your mind combines creativity and receptiveness when doing so. So this is the basis of a much larger teaching than I'm going to get into. If you look at the I Ching, in the I Ching, things are described. The male yang active creative principle is described with an unbroken line, bar, you might say, and the receptive is described with a broken one. So you end up with, if you look at Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Heaven is represented by three yang lines, three unbroken lines. Earth is represented by three broken lines. So if there are heavens, you could map it out this way, and you have exactly the same thing said yet again. You have heaven, something happens outside. Then earth, this is your body and how it's processing through two portals. It's processing what happened, and then it is also creative. It is synthesizing. So if you look at, somebody was creative in expressing something, your body received it, just like through your eyes. You see earth is an analogy to the two circles I drew from John, and seeing and separating, there's two things, and now heaven combines them again. And that is your mind's combining of those things. If you go further and extend it into hexagrams in the I Ching, you have the creative, which is 6 lines, the receptive, which is 12, and the creative again, which is 6. So you have 6, which are, you can see in both of these cases, the earth is really like a microcosm. You just have a smaller bar, but you can see it's from a different perspective, maybe further away, maybe God's perspective. You have the creative like a person, and then if you moved away from it, this would be, they're actually identical. And you moved away from this would be identical. But again, you have this connectivity, and it's two things. And then you have creative and receptive, which is 6 going to 12 back to 6. So someone was creative and did something, the receptive captures it, and the creative in your head then paints the picture that you will see, or creates the sounds that you will hear in your head. And there were 12 tribes of Israel, and Jesus resurrected those 12 tribes in a sense in the 12 apostles. And so that's this idea of the receptive. It's bringing back the receptive. By choosing 12 apostles, Jesus regathered what was scattered. You know, the idea was that the 12 tribes of Israel were scattered in the tower, the story of the Tower of Babel. And this looks like a tower, and this looks like things that were scattered. Jesus, by choosing 12 apostles, that specific number evokes that scattering, and evokes the 12 tribes, and then the regathering to describe like the fact that there's an external world, then there is your physical sensory devices, and then the creative is your brain, and which paints the picture that your mind sees. Now, if you go up here, see something interesting. You see these words: good, God, good, and God. So Adam and Eve got in trouble by eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And the word good is not equal to the word God. It's extra. If you think about the parable of the weeds, where the Son of Man plants a seed, and then enemy comes along and plants more seeds, but then at the harvest it gets eliminated. Basically, you could take the word God in English, which of course didn't exist at the time, but I am what I am. And then you would plant another seed, and also plant it, like if you think about writing the word God, G-O-D, you wouldn't, by injecting another one here, you're kind of not obeying the algorithm, the natural way of things and the flow of things. It was G-O-D, but then you're intervening and you're adding another one. And again, that's like your two eyes, but then it gets converged into one. It's the same pattern in the English language, which wouldn't exist for a long period of time, as it is in the I Ching, as it is in the beginning of the Gospel of John and the beginning of Genesis. So, you know, when Jesus says, if your right eye is your problem, gouge it out. And Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself. So if you gouge this out, the extra O in good, or if you love your neighbor as yourself and treat these as one thing, you go from God to good, which is how Adam and Eve got in trouble, eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Playing God is basically the essence of that. Because what happens when you go from God to good is, once you say that something is good, something else must be evil. So you've created two things. You've gone from what God made to more than what God made. So humans have started to muck with the design, and to do so in a way that is not intended. But the idea is you want to collapse it back. You want to gouge out an eye. You want to love your neighbor as yourself. That you like, just as your two eyes love them, are neighbors that create a unified image. Just as your two ear holes are two holes that create unified sound. You want to love your neighbor as yourself. Gouge out an eye. So you go from God to good, back to God. And what you end up with, like you think about, here's a zombie, and he's got eyes and ears. And you know, these are you know, they're neighbors, but like you end up with, like, you think about, like, you end up with not just a unity of vision, but you end up, vision and sound also get unified inside your mind. So the yin yang symbol is kind of a more complex representation of the fact that you have two portals through which things pass, and then you have your mind is creatively, something outside you creates something. That's his white creativity, goes through a dark hole in your skull that's small, and then inside your mind it creates something else. So it's a combination of creativity and receptivity. It's like a symphony, like a harmony that your mind creates. And when we interject and start to play God and decide what is good for other people, we have fucked things up royally. Anyway, that's a few things about I guess everything, but I'll post this and then add more to it later.